The hunger had become a constant companion, gnawing at Samuel Braddock's belly like a wolf that had taken up residence in his bones. 3 weeks had passed since he'd eaten anything more substantial than wild berries and stream water. 3 weeks since he'd made the decision that death by starvation was preferable to accepting help from a world that had taken everything from him. His cabin sat like a monument to isolation in the heart of the Wyoming Territory, surrounded by rolling grassland that stretched to horizons he no longer had the strength to contemplate. Samuel lay on his narrow cot, watching dust motes dance in the shafts of morning light that slanted through his single window. His body had moved beyond the sharp pangs of early hunger into that strange, floating numbness that came when the flesh began to consume itself. His clothes hung loose on a frame that had once been solid with muscle and hard work, and his hands trembled when he tried to lift them. This was what he wanted, he told himself. This was justice. The cattle that had once been his livelihood grazed freely across the range, ownerless now and returning to the wild state from which they had been claimed. His horse, a paint mare named Judith, had broken free from the corral 2 days ago, when Samuel no longer had the strength to tend to her. She had not gone far, lingering near the cabin as if sensing that something was terribly wrong with the man who had cared for her for 7 years. Samuel closed his eyes and let his mind drift back to the reason for his self-imposed exile from life itself. The images came unbidden, as they always did. Ellen's laugh as she hung laundry on the line behind their old cabin, her hands resting on the gentle swell of her belly where their first child grew. Little Thomas, barely 3 years old, chasing grasshoppers through the tall prairie grass while his mother called warnings about staying close to home. The perfect, simple life they had built together in this vast and unforgiving land. The fever had come in late summer, sweeping through the scattered homesteads like wildfire through dry grass. Diphtheria, the doctor from Cheyenne had called it, though his arrival had come too late to matter. First Thomas, his small body burning with heat that no amount of cool water could quench. Then Ellen, fighting to live long enough to see their unborn child, only to lose both battles in the space of a single, endless night. Samuel had buried them both under the cottonwood tree that Ellen had loved, the same tree where she had planned to hang a swing for their children to play on. He had carved their names into wooden markers with hands that shook from grief rather than hunger, and he had spoken words over their graves that felt hollow as autumn wind through empty bones. After that, he had simply stopped living, though his body had been slow to understand the decision his heart had made. The sound that roused him from his reverie was so soft, he almost mistook it for the whisper of wind through grass. But it came again, rhythmic and deliberate. The sound of many horses moving at a walk, leather creaking, and voices speaking in low, musical tones. Samuel forced himself to sit up, his vision graying at the edges from the sudden movement, and looked through the window toward the source of the sound. They came over the rise like a vision from another world, 40 or 50 Lakota Sioux moving in a loose column toward his cabin. Men, women and children on horseback, with travois dragging behind some of the horses loaded with bundled possessions. Their clothing was a mixture of traditional buckskin and trade goods, decorated with beadwork that caught the morning sun like scattered jewels. At their head rode an older man whose bearing spoke of authority earned through wisdom rather than force. Samuel's first instinct was fear, though he was too weak to act on it. Stories circulated through every settlement about Indian raids, about homesteaders found scalped and burned, about the ongoing war between the expanding white settlements and the tribes who had called this land home for generations, beyond counting. But as he watched the approaching group, he saw no weapons raised, no war paint, no signs of hostile intent. They moved with the calm purpose of people who had business to conduct, not violence to perpetrate. The older man dismounted near Samuel's porch and approached the door with slow, respectful steps. He was perhaps 60 years old, his long hair streaked with grey and braided with feathers and small bones. His face was weathered by decades of prairie sun and wind, but his eyes held a warmth that Samuel had not expected. When he spoke, his English was careful but clear, shaped by years of trading with white settlers. "I am called Standing Bear," the man said, his voice carrying easily in the still morning air. "We have traveled far to reach this place. May we speak with the one who lives here?" Samuel tried to stand, his legs shaking with the effort, and managed to make it to the door before his strength gave out entirely. He leaned against the frame, aware of how he must look, gaunt, hollow-eyed, more ghost than man. Standing Bear's expression shifted when he saw him, concern replacing the formal politeness of a first meeting. "You are sick," the old man observed, though it was clearly more than sickness that had reduced Samuel to this state. "Not sick," Samuel managed, his voice a rasp that barely carried. "Just indefinished." Standing Bear studied him for a long moment, his dark eyes taking in the signs of deliberate starvation, the empty corral, the general air of abandonment that hung over the homestead. Behind him, the rest of the tribe had spread out in a loose semicircle, watching the exchange with quiet attention. Samuel could see children peeking out from behind their mothers, and women preparing what looked like food over small fires that had appeared with practiced efficiency. "You choose this?" Standing Bear asked, gesturing towards Samuel's wasted condition. "You choose to die in this way?" Samuel nodded slowly. "Nothing left to live for. Figured it was time to join my family." No, the old man's expression softened with understanding. "You have lost much, this I can see, but dying from hunger when there is food, dying alone when there are people willing to share, this is not the way of a warrior." "I'm no warrior," Samuel said, sliding down the doorframe to sit on the threshold. "Just a man who failed to protect what mattered most." Standing Bear was quiet for a moment, then he turned and spoke rapidly in Lakota to the people behind him. Samuel caught none of the words, but he could hear the tone, authoritative but gentle, like a father explaining something important to his children. Several of the women began moving with renewed purpose, and the smell of cooking food drifted across the yard. "My granddaughter," Standing Bear said, turning back to Samuel. "She had a vision 3 nights ago. She saw a white man dying in a cabin surrounded by grass, dying not from wounds or sickness, but from sadness that had eaten his spirit. She said the spirits told her we must come to this place, that we must feed this man and hear his story." Samuel looked past the old chief to where a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, was stirring something in an iron pot over one of the fires. She had the same gentle eyes as her grandfather, and when she caught him looking, she offered a shy smile before returning to her work. "Visions," Samuel said weakly. "Don't much believe in that sort of thing." "Belief is not required," Standing Bear replied, with what might have been amusement. "Truth exists whether we accept it or not. My granddaughter Winona has the sight, as her grandmother did before her. When she speaks of visions, we listen." The old man settled cross-legged on the ground near Samuel's doorstep, his movements fluid despite his apparent age. "You will tell me about your family, about what brought you to this place of choosing death over life, and while you speak, my people will prepare food. You will eat, and you will remember what it means to be among the living." Samuel wanted to protest, to explain that he had no desire for food or company or the complicated business of continued existence. But something in Standing Bear's manner made refusal seem not just rude, but impossible. There was an authority there that had nothing to do with force and everything to do with the kind of wisdom that came from surviving decades in a harsh and unforgiving world. So Samuel talked, his voice growing stronger as the words came. He told Standing Bear about Ellen's laugh and Thomas's curiosity, about the fever that had taken them both and the empty silence that had filled their absence. He spoke of the guilt that gnawed at him worse than hunger, The knowledge that he had been away buying supplies when the sickness came, that he had failed in the most basic duty of a husband and father. Standing Bear listened without judgment or interruption, occasionally nodding or making soft sounds of understanding. Around them, the Lakota camp had settled into a comfortable routine, children playing quiet games while their mothers worked, and the men tended to horses and weapons. It felt strange to Samuel, this invasion of life into his carefully constructed solitude, but not unwelcome in the way he had expected. When Winona approached with a bowl of stew, Samuel's stomach cramped painfully at the smell of meat and vegetables. He had not realized how much his body missed food until it was placed before him, rich and warm and prepared with obvious care. His hands shook as he lifted the spoon, and his first few bites came back up almost immediately, but Winona simply cleaned up the mess without comment and brought him smaller portions, teaching him with patient gestures how to eat again after weeks of refusing sustenance. "The body forgets," Standing Bear observed, as Samuel managed to keep down a few spoonfuls of broth. "But it remembers quickly when treated with kindness." As the day wore on, Samuel found himself drawn into the rhythms of the camp despite his intention to remain aloof. Children brought him small gifts, smooth stones, interesting feathers, flowers picked from the prairie grass. The women took turns ensuring he had water and small amounts of food, treating him with the same matter-of-fact care they might show to any member of their community who was unwell. It was Winona who finally told him why they had come, speaking in careful English while she rewrapped his wrists where the bones showed too clearly through stretched skin. Her vision had been specific, she explained. Not just a dying white man, but one whose death would somehow prevent a greater tragedy from unfolding. The spirits had shown her images of soldiers, of burning teepees, of children running through grass stained with blood. "You are connected to this future," she said, her dark eyes serious. "Your death, or your life, both have meaning beyond what you see. The spirits rarely speak so clearly, but when they do, we must listen." Samuel wanted to dismiss her words as superstition, the kind of mystical thinking that civilized men were supposed to reject. But there was something in her manner, a certainty that spoke of experiences beyond his understanding, that made him consider possibilities he had not imagined. What if his isolation here was not just about grief and guilt? What if there was some larger purpose he had been too lost in his own pain to recognize? That evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of red and gold, Standing Bear sat with Samuel beside a small fire outside the cabin. The old chief had produced a pipe from his belongings, and they passed it back and forth in comfortable silence while the camp settled into evening routines around them. "You think I'm meant to live," Samuel said finally, "but I don't know how. Everything I cared about is gone." Standing Bear was quiet for a long moment, watching smoke rise toward the emerging stars. "Loss is not the end of the story," he said finally. "It is the middle. The question is not whether you will live, but how you will choose to live. What you will build from the ashes of what was taken." "I don't have anything left to build with," Samuel replied. "You have breath in your lungs and strength returning to your limbs. You have land that could feed many people and water that runs clean. You have skills learned through years of hard work and knowledge gained through suffering. These are not small things." The old man pointed toward the edge of the camp, where several young men were working to repair a broken wagon wheel. "My people, we are traveling to the agency for the winter rations the government has promised, but the promises grow smaller each year, and the journey grows more dangerous. We cannot hunt as we once did. The buffalo are nearly gone, and the soldiers watch for any sign that we have left the boundaries they have set for us." Samuel felt a stirring of something that might have been understanding. "You're saying I could help by staying here, by offering shelter? I'm saying that a man who chooses to live again might find many ways to serve the world around him. My granddaughter's vision showed more than just your death prevented. It showed friendship built in unexpected places, bridges created where there had been only empty space." That night, Samuel slept more soundly than he had in weeks, his belly partially full and his body warming from the shared heat of the fire. He woke before dawn to find Winona tending the coals, preparing what smelled like some kind of medicinal tea. She offered him a cup without words, and he drank it gratefully, feeling strength begin to flow back into his depleted system. Over the following days, a routine developed that felt both strange and natural. The Lakota remained camped near his cabin, while several of their number recovered from various ailments: a broken arm that needed time to heal, a pregnant woman nearing her time, an elder whose cough had worsened during their travels. Samuel found himself useful in small ways, sharing his knowledge of the local area, helping to repair equipment, and gradually taking on more of the physical tasks as his strength returned. In return, they taught him things he had never imagined he might need to know: how to read weather signs in the behavior of animals, how to find water in seemingly barren ground, how to prepare foods from plants that grew wild across the prairie. Winona showed him how to make medicines from herbs and roots, knowledge that might have saved his family if he had possessed it months earlier. The guilt was still there, sharp and persistent as a blade between his ribs. But it was beginning to transform into something else. Not absolution, which seemed impossible, but perhaps purpose. He could not bring back Ellen and Thomas, could not undo his failure to protect them. But he could choose to live in a way that honored their memory, that created something meaningful from the ruins of his former life. It was Standing Bear who finally put words to what they were all beginning to understand. The old chief approached Samuel one morning as he was working to repair the cabin's damaged roof, his movements stronger and more coordinated than they had been since the tribal camp arrived. "We will leave soon," Standing Bear said without preamble. "The agency expects us before the first snow, and we cannot delay much longer. But my granddaughter's vision has shown her more than just your recovery. She sees a time when our peoples will need bridges between their worlds, places where understanding might grow instead of fear." Samuel paused in his work, hammer in hand, and looked down at the old man. "You're asking me to be one of those bridges. I am suggesting that you already are. This place, your knowledge of both worlds, your experience of loss that my people understand, these things make you valuable in ways you may not realize. The soldiers who will come, the settlers who will follow, they will not all be enemies if there are men like you to speak for peace instead of war." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the direction of the main trail, the sound of horses ridden hard and voices raised in alarm. Samuel climbed down from the roof as a lone rider came into view, a young Lakota warrior who had been serving as a scout for the group. He spoke rapidly to Standing Bear in their native language, his words carrying obvious urgency and fear. Standing Bear's expression darkened as he listened, and when the scout finished speaking, the old chief turned to address his people in the same rapid Lakota. The response was immediate. Organized chaos as the camp began to pack with practiced efficiency. Samuel caught enough of the tone to understand that danger was approaching, though he could not make out the specifics. "Soldiers," Standing Bear explained tersely, "a full troop, perhaps 50 men, moving this way from the agency. They are looking for us, claiming that we have broken the terms of our agreement by leaving the designated area." Samuel felt cold fear settle in his stomach. He had heard enough stories to know how such encounters usually ended, with Indian families scattered or killed, their leaders arrested or executed, their children sent to distant schools designed to kill the Indian in them. The approaching soldiers would see only hostiles, where Samuel now saw friends and teachers. "How long before they arrive?" he asked. "Perhaps 2 hours, maybe less if they push hard." Samuel looked around at the faces of people who had saved his life, who had pulled him back from the edge of self-destruction and shown him that hope could exist even in the darkest circumstances. Children who had brought him flowers, women who had fed him when he was too weak to feed himself, men who had shared their wisdom and their fire. The decision, when it came, felt as natural as breathing. "You're not going anywhere," he said quietly. "This is my land, and you're my guests. Let the soldiers come." Standing Bear studied his face for a long moment. "You do not understand what you are offering. These soldiers, they will not listen to reason. They will see only what they expect to see. A white man held captive, Indians who must be punished for their defiance." "Then I'll have to convince them otherwise," Samuel replied. "Maybe it's time I started living up to what you people seem to think I am." The next 2 hours passed in tense preparation. The Lakota struck their camp with silent efficiency, but instead of fleeing, they repositioned themselves in a defensive arrangement around Samuel's cabin. Weapons were checked and readied, though Standing Bear made it clear that they would fight only if attacked first. The women and children were moved to positions of relative safety, while the warriors spread out to cover the approaches to the homestead. Samuel cleaned himself up as best he could, putting on his cleanest shirt and making an effort to look like a man in control of his own property rather than someone who had been starving himself to death. He positioned himself on the front porch, visible and clearly unharmed, while Standing Bear and several other leaders arranged themselves nearby in non-threatening but dignified positions. The soldiers arrived in a cloud of dust and barely controlled aggression. Their officer, a young captain with the rigid bearing of someone trying too hard to project authority, surveying the scene with obvious confusion. Samuel could see him trying to reconcile what he was seeing with whatever reports had led to this confrontation. "I'm Captain Morrison," the officer announced, his voice carrying across the yard. "We're here about the hostile Indians reported in this area. Are you being held against your will, sir?" Samuel stepped forward, his voice calm and clear. "I'm Samuel Braddock, and this is my property. These people are my guests, not my captors. There's been some kind of misunderstanding." Morrison's eyes swept the assembled Lakota, taking in their relaxed but alert postures, the obvious signs of a peaceful camp rather than a war party. But Samuel could see the young man struggling with preconceptions, with orders that might not match the reality he was confronting. "Our scouts reported a large band of renegade Indians in this sector," Morrison said. "Indians who have violated the terms of their agency agreement. My orders are to apprehend them and return them to the reservation." "These people are traveling to the agency for winter rations," Samuel replied. "They stopped here because several of their number needed medical attention. I can vouch for their peaceful intentions. They've done nothing but help me during a difficult time." Standing Bear rose slowly from where he had been sitting, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. "Captain Morrison," he said, his English formal but clear, "I am Standing Bear, chief of this band. We have broken no laws. We travel the path we have always traveled, stopping where we have always stopped. Your agencies expect us, but they do not expect us to fly like birds or travel without rest." The captain looked between Samuel and Standing Bear, clearly struggling with a situation that did not match his training or expectations. His men waited behind him, hands near their weapons, but not yet drawn, following their leader's uncertain example. "You'll understand if I find this situation unusual," Morrison said finally. "White settlers and Indians camping together peacefully is not something we encounter often in our patrols." Samuel stepped down from the porch, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible. "Maybe that's because not enough people have tried it, Captain. These people saved my life. They found me dying and chose to help instead of leaving me to my fate. If that's not Christian charity, I don't know what is." For a long moment, the scene hung in perfect balance, dozens of armed men on both sides, a young officer whose next decision could mean the difference between peace and bloodshed, and Samuel standing in the middle as a bridge between two worlds that too often met only in violence. Morrison made his choice, with the kind of wisdom that suggested he might survive long enough to become a good leader. "I'll need to inspect your camp," he said to Standing Bear. "Verify that you're carrying no contraband weapons, that you have proper documentation for your travel, but if everything checks out, you can continue on your way with an escort to ensure safe passage." Aye. The inspection was thorough but respectful, Morrison's men professional in their duties but not aggressive. Samuel watched with growing pride as the captain took note of the medical supplies, the carefully organized families, the clear evidence that this was a group traveling peacefully rather than a war party seeking trouble. When it was over, Morrison approached Samuel one final time. "I don't pretend to understand what's happening here," he said quietly, "but whatever you've done, it probably prevented a lot of bloodshed today. These people could have scattered into the hills, made us chase them for weeks. Instead, they stood their ground because they trusted you to speak for them." Samuel nodded, feeling the weight of that trust settle on his shoulders, like a mantle he was only beginning to understand how to wear. "They're good people, Captain. They deserve better than the hand they've been dealt." "Maybe," Morrison replied, "but the world is changing, and changing fast. There's going to be less and less room for the old ways, more pressure to either adapt or get swept aside. People like you, who can speak both languages and understand both sides, you're going to be important in what comes next." After the soldiers left, providing the promised escort for Standing Bear's people, Samuel found himself alone with Winona beside the dying fire. The rest of the tribe had departed with expressions of gratitude and promises to return when the seasons turned favorable again. But Standing Bear's granddaughter had lingered, claiming that her vision was not yet complete. "You see something else," Samuel said. It was not a question. Winona nodded, her dark eyes reflecting the last flames of the fire. "I see a white man who learns to live again, who builds something new from the ashes of his old life. I see children learning in 2 languages, families finding safety where there was once only emptiness. I see a place where the future begins." Samuel looked out over the prairie, at the vast expanse of grass and sky that had seemed like a tomb just days before. Now it looked like possibility, like space for something he could not yet fully imagine, but was beginning to understand he might be capable of creating. "Will you stay?" he asked. "Help me figure out what that looks like." Winona smiled, and in that expression Samuel saw his answer and his future. Not the life he had planned with Ellen and Thomas. That story was finished, written in grief and carved in stone. But something new, something that honored their memory by refusing to let their deaths be the end of hope. The next morning, Samuel began the work of building again, not just repairing his cabin and his health, but creating something larger, a place where 2 worlds might meet and find common ground, where the future might be shaped by understanding rather than fear. It would not be easy, and it would not erase the past, but it would be worthy of the love he had lost and the life he had chosen to reclaim. And sometimes, when the wind blew just right across the prairie grass, he thought he could hear Ellen's laugh mixing with Winona's voice, and Thomas's giggle echoing in the sounds of children who would learn to build bridges where others had dug trenches. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the beginning of everything.